All right, so now we're going to talk about language. So we were discussing in the last part about concepts and cognition and how those things represent um, processes going on mentally. Well, the main way that we can convey to somebody else what we're thinking or what's going on in our heads is through language. It is the spoken, written, or signed words that we use to communicate what we're thinking. And this is the modality you're learning right now. It's how we transmit culture to one another through the generation. To be considered a language, we need certain characteristics. So languages all have certain rules that they follow. Languages, by definition, are creative and generative. That means that there is no limit to the way you can combine words together to convey whatever you're thinking. Language allows for displacement. It allows us to talk about things that are not physically present. We can talk about things that are only conceptual, only represented as an idea. And all languages have symbols. So even American Sign Language meets all the criteria for a language. Right, so now we're going to talk about the units of language. So in languages, a phoneme is the term we use for the smallest unit of sound. So in a spoken language, the smallest unit that represents a speech sound is known as a phoneme. A morpheme is our smallest unit of meaning. A morpheme could be a single word. A morpheme could be a part of a word, like a prefix or a suffix, if it conveys meaning. So we could say, I am rereading the chapter. Rereading has three morphemes. Read, the prefix re, which means I am doing something again, and then the suffix ing means whatever I'm doing it right now. So you could take a simple sentence like the boy hit the ball. Every word in that sentence is a morpheme, and each of those words is made up of individual speech sounds, phonemes. Some phonemes, like the th in the, can only be conveyed with two letters together, the th. So in the English language, we have a phoneme for every single letter of the alphabet, and then letters can have multiple phonemes, like we can have the C representing the hard C, like in cat, or the soft C, as in ceiling. For our vowels, we can have the long and the short vowels. We can have two letters together representing one united sound, like the th in the. So languages have their own phonemes, and phonemes vary by language. There are many languages where there are not an English equivalent to that phoneme, which is why if a person learns a second language as an adult and that language has phonemes that are not present in their native language, they will always speak that second language with an accent. So if you are bilingual or multilingual, think of the other languages you know. Think of the sounds that you might have in that language that we don't have in English. So I know Spanish. So in Spanish, you have the phoneme represented by the N with the tilde that makes the ñ sound. There's no equivalent in the English language. We have the double L, which there's no equivalent of in English. It sort of makes the yus sound like in amarillo. We have the rolling R in Spanish. So me, as a non-native Spanish speaker, if I were to try to speak Spanish, they definitely would hear me speaking with an accent when I said words that in particular had those sounds. So languages, like we said, have rules which govern them. So syntax is the term we use for the rules that tell us where words and phrases should go in that language. So again, to use my Spanish example, Spanish has things in common with many other languages. English is sort of unusual that in English we put our adjectives before our nouns. So we would say the little boy, whereas in Spanish, as well as in many other languages, you would say the noun first, then the adjective. El niño pequeño. So that is an example of syntax. Grammar refers to the rules that tell us how we can meaningfully combine elements of language so that we have a full grammatically correct sentence. And then semantics is the term used to refer to the rules which bring meaning to words and sentences. The things that give you a context. We definitely rely on semantics when we are able to understand a sentence that uses a word, but in different contexts, that word has different meanings. So we can use the same word like snap, and because of the context in which we're using that word and the words around it in the sentence, we can understand it means something different when I say, can you snap your fingers? Or I can get this homework done in a snap. And then we have pragmatics. Pragmatics are the social rules. The rules that tell us how to take turns in speaking, how you adjust how you speak in different situations, in different social settings. So it is pragmatics to know that maybe when you're hanging out with your friends, it's acceptable to drop the F-bomb, but maybe sitting around Thanksgiving dinner with grandma, not so much. That is pragmatics. In English, it is a pragmatic rule that if we pause when we're speaking, that's sort of the social cue that tells the other person, okay, now it's your turn to talk. Even something like that does not mean the same in every language. So in many East Asian languages, like if we were to go to Japan, for example, and someone were to pause and me as an English speaker think, okay, that means it's now my time to talk, and I start talking, I would be seen as incredibly rude because it has different pragmatic meanings. In Japanese, a pause means whatever I just said, it is so important. I sort of want it to sink in. And then you, like, starting to talk then is really rude because you're sort of negating the importance of what I said. So in different languages, you will even find different pragmatic rules. So you have this infographic in your textbook that helps you understand these different concepts and building blocks of language. All right. So you have a little active psych demonstration here about language development. I would encourage you to pause me and to go through that. But language development is something we're going to address in even more detail in our development chapter. But what you see on the screen here represents the major language milestones in humans learning to speak. One of the things we find is that it doesn't matter where in the world you are and what language you are using, we go through these same type of milestones at approximately the same time frames. There's a little variability, but for most humans, this is the norm. So already by 4 to 6 months, you are starting to say the phonemes of your own native language that you are accustomed to hearing. Already in the first 4 months, you've developed the ability to discriminate those phonemes. We come into the world prepared to hear and learn any language on the face of the earth. But already in those first 4 months, we are able to identify which sounds apply to language and which don't. Another thing to keep in mind about language development is that receptive language develops before expressive language. So that means kids are able to understand what is said to them before they are able to say something themselves. So already a baby 6 to 10 months, you can give them simple commands. Hand daddy the diaper, come here. And they would understand that and maybe be able to follow those directions, even though those are statements they can't say themselves. So most kids are saying their first real words by their first birthday. And again, if it is very much after that, then it could be reason to be concerned, something to bring to the attention of a pediatrician. Maybe the child will need a speech and language development. And then by 2 years, they are starting to combine words in meaningful ways. We often refer to this as telegraphic speech because they're not always speaking in full sentences, but they're saying things together that convey meaning, like my toy, me cookie. You know that they want, a cookie, for example. And then in the toddler years, we see this huge growth in vocabulary. And again, we're going to cover this in the next chapter even more, that the more a kid is spoken to, the more a kid is read to, the better their vocabulary is going to be. Such that by the time a kid is 5 and entering kindergarten, they are considered fluent in their native language. They have a vocabulary of at least 10,000 words. They're able to speak in grammatically correct sentences. They're able to talk about things in different tenses and talk about the past and the present and the future. So with regards to language, different people from different perspectives of psychology would propose different reasons for, well, why do we acquire language the way we do? So behaviorists like B.F. Skinner, who focused on learning and believe everything is learned, would say the same holds true for language. You learn it because of principles of operant conditioning. You associate words with things in the world that they represent. You're learning because you are imitating what you hear and what is spoken to you. And that language has reinforcement. When you're first learning language, parents get really excited, they hug you, they praise you, they smile at you. It encourages you to talk. And then as you develop more language, it sort of becomes self-reinforcing because you're able to ask for what you want and get it. So that is one explanation for why we learn language. As you remember from when you first learned the perspectives of psychology, if you focus exclusively on one perspective, you're going to be missing something. So people would bring up, well, if you're ever around little kids, invariably they're going to say something that nobody has modeled for them, nobody has reinforced for them. Why would they say such a thing? So let's say, for example, a little preschooler comes home from school and the dad says, "What'd you do during recess today?" And the kid says, "Oh, I run a race." Well, why would he say runned? Nobody certainly would have modeled that for him or reinforced it. If he said that, most parents would say, we ran. So that is why cognitive folks like Noam Chomsky say there's got to be something else going on. Why is it that kids can start saying things without having to hear every example of it first? How is it that they so quickly can start generalizing rules of grammar and to recognize a lot of verbs which you want to talk about in the past tense, you add ed to. So you come up with I runned yesterday. Why would that be? Also, why would kids from around the world learning different languages develop at almost the same pace? Well, folks like Chomsky would say there's got to be something that's biologically determining it. There's got to be something about the human brain that allows us to learn language as quickly as we can and to generalize rules of grammar without having to hear every single example of everything we ultimately might learn to say. Now, he was a cognitivist, not a biologist, so he said there must be something in the brain. He wasn't talking about specifically a certain structure or anything. And that something, he gave the term the language acquisition device, the LAD. He said there's got to be something that we're born with that allows us to learn language the way we do. Now, as we've talked about before, we usually get our best explanations when we don't restrict ourselves to one perspective or one explanation, and that's what's known as the interactionist explanation for language. So it doesn't negate either of the previous perspectives. It says, maybe we do have a language acquisition device that does allow us to learn language as quickly as we can, but you still need to be exposed to language to learn it. If no one ever talks to you, reads to you, you never see a TV, you're not just automatically going to learn language. And also, all that pragmatic stuff, all that social rules of language, you're never going to learn unless somebody interacts with you and it becomes part of your socialization. So the interactionist approach says both are really important. All right, so the next objective is to talk about how language influences thought. This is what is known as the linguistic relativity hypothesis. So this means that it's very hard to separate thought from language, that having a word for something affects how you can think about that thing. So the classic example is the Inuit language, those folks the natives who, First Nation people who live like in Northwest Canada, and Alaska area that we used to refer to inappropriately as Eskimos. The Inuit language has many more words for snow than English does, which means that they have a more nuanced way of being able to think about snow because they have more words for it. So they will have a word for wet snow and drier snow and heavy snow and light snow. And the fact that you have a word for it affects how you can think about it. Other examples of the linguistic relativity hypothesis. Think of maybe a hobby or pastime that you engage in that has some vocabulary unique to it. That because you know that vocabulary, you are able to think about that sport, that hobby differently than someone who doesn't know the language. So there's a lot of unique vocabulary to music, to different sports, that somebody who knows that vocabulary, heck, even psychology, there's vocabulary to that because I know some words that maybe you don't, I'm able to think about that concept differently. So that is what's known as the linguistic relativity hypothesis. That was exemplified in a study such as this. So every one of these swatches of color is the exact amount of difference in hue as the one previous to it. So that means this one is as different to this one as this one is as different to this one, and this one is as different to this one. So in terms of the degree of changes in hue, it is identical between every single swatch of color. But having a word impacts how you think about that. So when arbitrarily these swatches were referred to as green, and these ones were referred to as blue, and then they asked people which one is more different, the pair in A or the pair in B, most people would say A, because now they're crossing a language barrier. They're going from green to blue, when in actuality there's no difference between the pair in A or the pair in B. But having a difference in language influences how we think. All right, so now we're going to get into intelligence and different theories of intelligence. And again, I'm going to introduce more than what is in the book here. So intelligence is one of those challenging things to talk about because it's a mental activity and we can't see it. We can't plop it on a scale and weigh it. It's very abstract. So because it's abstract, different people have thought of it in different ways. which is why we have different theories in this section of the chapter. Despite the different theories, most will agree it's something desirable. It's some mental ability that allows us to learn and to solve problems and adapt to our situations, and to use what we know. But beyond that, there's a lot of differences in how people think about intelligences and even a little bit of controversy. So we're going to see that different theories differ in how they think of intelligence. Is intelligence one thing, or is it a bunch of different things? Where does it come from? Are you born with it, or is it a result of, the experiences you've had and the books you've read? Some big controversies are things like, are there racial differences in intelligence? Are there gender differences in intelligence? Can we even measure intelligence in a fair and unbiased way that is informative? Things like, how does creativity come into play? We're going to see that some of the theories of intelligence see creativity as a part of intelligence. Others see it as something related, but yet separate. So one of the oldest and simplest theories of intelligence is that of Spearman, who saw intelligence as this one overarching thing that he called general intelligence, or the G factor. That if you had it, it's going to help you in lots of situations. The higher your G factor, the better you're going to be at work, at school, socially. So it's this one overall thing, this one overall general ability that you then can apply to different areas of your life. We're going to see this idea of G, the G factor, is found in a few of the different theories, that they have retained this idea of general ability. Other theories, like one proposed by a guy by the name of Thurstone, said intelligence isn't one thing, it is a cluster of different things. And in his model of intelligence, he proposed 7 different mental abilities, and you're going to see this is something that is found in later theories of intelligence. Some aspects of intelligence are things that you can express in words. Some are things that you can only assess and express non-verbally. Some represent numerical abilities. Some represent memory. So this started with Thurstone, and he said, if we wanted to talk about some general ability, then what it would be is us, adding up all of these abilities and coming up with the sum, and that would be your general ability. In the 1980s, Howard Gardner proposed what he called his theory of multiple intelligences that really looked at intelligence in a very different way. Gardner's theory was attractive to many people because they saw it as giving credit to lots of different human behaviors that we value and we find important that maybe were not necessarily identified with intelligence in the past. So his theory really expands the definition of intelligence, and Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences says there are 8 main ways that we can be smart, and that they're independent of one another. So your strength in one area is independent of where you might be in another area, and that success in these different areas of intelligence can lend themselves to success in different types of professions and tasks. So there are aspects of Gardner's theory that are consistent with past theories like Thurstone. So he talks about linguistic intelligence, intelligence with words. And this is something that we find in past theories. So if you're good with words, you have good linguistic intelligence, you might be a good writer, a good speaker. He talked about logical and mathematical intelligence. That was something that was found in past theories. He talked about spatial intelligence, being able to think in imagery and pictures, um, to imagine things in your mind without words. So he would say if you're a good artist, if you're a good architect, you probably have good spatial intelligence. But that's sort of where the similarities end. Then he started talking about other areas of intelligence. Things like musical intelligence. If you can read and play and compose music, most people would value that. Most people would say that is definitely a sign of intelligent behavior. I have the utmost respect for anyone who can play and write and read music, because I can't, and I tried to learn as an adult and I really struggled and did not get very far. So definitely it's a valued human behavior. He talked about bodily kinesthetic intelligence. If you can deal with your own body well, if you're a dancer, a gymnast, he would say you've got good body kinesthetic intelligence. He talked about interpersonal intelligence, how well you can interact and relate to and read other people. And he would say if you're a good teacher, if you're a good therapist, if you're a good leader, you probably have good interpersonal intelligence. And then intrapersonal intelligence is how well do you understand yourself? So folks good in philosophy and things like that who can reflect on their own thinking, that represents intrapersonal intelligence. And then finally, naturalistic intelligence. How well can you recognize patterns in nature, for example? So this theory attracted many people in that it's giving credit to human behaviors that were not really credited before as being intelligent. However, this is a theory that's hard to prove. There's no intelligence test that I know of that was ever made based on Howard Gardner's theory of intelligence. And if there was, that would probably be a very hard test to give as well as take, because it might mean I would have to have you speak and do math and play music and dance for me and all of that to test the different areas of intelligence. Robert Sternberg gave us a theory of intelligence that is unique because it includes creativity as an aspect of intelligence. So his theory is called the triarchic theory of intelligence. So tri meaning that three. And he says there's three ways that you can express intelligence, and that the most successful person would probably be someone who is strong in all three. So there's analytic intelligence. This is the kind of intelligence that has been measured with traditional intelligence tests. But then there's also what he calls practical intelligence. Your ability to adapt to life demands and to do what is required, for you. And then creative intelligence, your ability to think in new ways. So if you reflect on Sternberg's triarchic theory of intelligence, you can probably think of people who show the triarchic theory of intelligence in that you see them being very strong in one, but very weak in another. So maybe someone has really good analytic intelligence. They are what we might call book smart. They got great grades all through school, but maybe their practical intelligence isn't so great. They can't remember how to pay the bills on time, or to, find their way to different places, or balance the checkbook, or just handle what life throws at you. Likewise, you might think of people who've been very creative. They think of really new ways of doing things and making things. And again, and could be independent of the other two. Maybe they weren't the best students. Maybe they weren't, didn't have that analytical side of intelligence. But it shows that you can be creative, and that creativity in Sternberg's theory is a way of being intelligent. It is a part of intelligence. All right, so again, this next section is the part that again leads us into the most modern theory of intelligence that sadly is not in your textbook. So I am still holding you accountable for what follows. So our modern theory of intelligence started with these two, Raymond Cattell and John Horn, which is why the beginnings of the most modern theory of intelligence is referred to as the Cattell-Horn theory of intelligence. They talked about there being two types of intelligence, fluid and crystallized. So fluid they refer to as GF, and crystallized GC. And again, that G referring back to that general ability factor talked about by Spearman, the very first theory we brought up. The reason these two abilities, types of reasoning, are so important is because they presented hard data that showed us these are real types of human abilities that have different developmental pathways. And they showed that the fluid reasoning is something that gets better, and then when you're in young adulthood, it's at its peak, and then it levels off, and then it sort of dips in old age. We're going to cover this more in our development chapter. So fluid reasoning is your ability to sort of think on your feet, to solve new problems, to deal with stuff you've never dealt with before or you haven't learned before because it's brand new to you. Crystallized intelligence is the kind of intelligence you get from schooling, from reading, from having life experiences. It is the ability to use this accumulation of knowledge and facts that you have. As long as you don't get something like Alzheimer's or some neurodegenerative disease, if you continue to read, if you continue to watch the news, continue to have life experiences, your crystallized intelligence can continue to grow until the day you die. And the more experiences you have, the stronger it will be. So the modern theory started with these two and these two main abilities. Then in the 90s, John Carroll presented what he called the three-stratum theory of intelligence. So stratum meaning like a layer. So he says we've got three layers to intelligence. And one of the layers is the G factor, that general ability. But he was more focused on the middle layer, stratum 2, which he referred to as the broad abilities. And then he said under every single broad ability, you could have some very, very specific skills or narrow abilities. Now, if you see, two of the broad abilities he mentioned were fluid reasoning and crystallized intelligence, which were the same that Cattell and Horn we're talking about. So ultimately, the most modern theory of intelligence combines those two theories. So even though we're dealing with theorists who never necessarily all three worked together at the same time, they were dealing with the same stuff conceptually. So the most modern day theory combines all of them. So it's called the Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory of intelligence, often abbreviated CHC for their names. And this is the theory that most modern day tests of intelligence are based on, and that we have the most research to support. So CHC theory proposes we do have a general ability factor, but the greater emphasis is on the broad abilities, because there's lots of research that shows different broad abilities are vital to learning different kinds of things at different ages, particularly academically. And that still is the biggest reason why someone might get an intelligence test, for example, because the kid's struggling in school or something, and maybe someone's trying to diagnose a disability. So that's because we have data that tells us different broad abilities are necessary for the different kinds of learning in school. And then there is the narrow abilities. Under each of those broad abilities, there's some very, very specific skills you could have. So like I said, the greatest emphasis is on the broad abilities. This is where we have our most research. So let's start with GC, crystallized intelligence, or sometimes in CHC theory referred to as comprehension knowledge. This is the wealth of facts you have accumulated and your ability to put those facts to use. This includes all the knowledge you have gained, all the vocabulary that you have. This is the one broad ability that we find consistently linked to every single subject area at every grade level. And that's because so much of traditional learning is verbal. You're reading textbooks, you're listening to teachers. So the more facts you have, the better your vocabulary is, the better you're able to put the things you're reading and learning into a context, the more you're going to learn. So this is one of the broad abilities that's going to serve you well in every single subject area at every single grade level. And then the other one from the original theory, the fluid reasoning, your ability to solve new problems. You can't rely on your past learning because this is the first time you're ever seeing it, and you've got to deal with it. This is a vital broad ability for higher levels of math, for math reasoning, not learning basic math facts, but being able to solve new problems, to be presented with a situation and to then know this is the kind of formula I would need to use in that kind of situation. So like solving a word problem, for example, in math. The next broad ability in CHC theory is visual spatial thinking. Thinking without words, solving problems that involve picturing things in your head, maybe rotating things in your head, imagining the image from a different perspective. This is the one broad ability that, although it's important to human intelligence, it is not linked significantly to any important academic area. It might help you in some aspects of geometry, it might help you in some aspects of reading maps and social studies, but for the most part it is not significantly linked to any academic area. And sadly, in testing kids in my past as a school psychologist, often found the kids with learning disabilities or cognitive impairments might still have great visual spatial thinking, but it doesn't serve them very well in school at all, sadly. The next is long-term retrieval. This is not long-term memory, but it is how quickly and efficiently you can pull stuff out of your long-term memory when you need it. Tests of long-term retrieval are often very simple to give. They would be time tests, and it might be like, you have a minute, tell me as many fruits as you can think of in a minute, go. And that is long-term retrieval, how quickly I can bring facts out of my mind when I need it. Long-term retrieval becomes more important as you get into the higher grades, and fluency tasks become more prominent. So academic fluency means doing things with automaticity and speed. So when you are a fluent reader, you're not sounding out every single word you come to. You are quickly recognizing the word pattern, immediately pulling that word from your long-term memory. Or in math fluency would mean you see 2 plus 2 and you automatically know 4. You're not bringing out your fingers and calculating it. So that is what long-term retrieval is all about. Then there's auditory processing. This is your ability to deal with phonemes. We talked about that as the smallest unit of sound when we were talking about language. So how well can you analyze and synthesize and discriminate those sounds? This is the kind of skill that is essential for learning how to read. Before you even are introduced to the printed word, you need to be able to discriminate sounds. So kids who grasp reading early, even before they were ready to read, could do things like rhyming and play with sounds and things like that. In kids who have dyslexia, the most common learning disability. It's just a general term for a reading disability. It's not really an official diagnosis. Most kids with a reading disability, their problem lies in auditory processing. They have a hard time discriminating sounds. Now, in the past, a lot of people would think that if you had a reading disability, if you had dyslexia, it was probably due to something visual, because a common thing would be kids with dyslexia tend to get letters reversed. So things like D and B, and get them confused. And people would think it must be something visual. Well, it's actually an auditory processing problem. It's not that they're not seeing the difference. It's just that they just don't know which label applies to which, because they've got auditory processing problems. They had trouble even from a young age of understanding and discriminating those phonemes. So when you're a little kid learning these letters, you have to be able to discriminate sounds so that when a teacher says this is a B and this is a D, that you're able to discriminate the P in B from the T in D. A kid with auditory processing problems might be perceiving this is E, and then they're never able to associate the right letter, and then associating the right letter with the right sound pattern gets even more difficult, and then their whole trajectory on learning how to read gets thrown right off. It does not help that our alphabet works like this, where we've got letters that you turn them a different way and suddenly there's something different, because again, that's mind-blowing to a kid because no other place in their life did they encounter that. This is a phone, this is a phone, this is a phone. It didn't change depending on how I turned it. But then they come into school and some brilliant teacher's telling them something this way means one thing and this way means another. Another broad ability is processing speed. This is another one that's important through the grades. It is how well can you sustain attention and do things that don't necessarily involve deep reasoning or thinking, but you got to stay on task and you got to handle time pressure. That's something that you find in a lot of areas in school, that you need to be able to stick with something and to keep up the pace. That's what processing speed is about. So it's another broad ability, pretty important through the grade levels and the different academic areas. Then another broad ability is short-term memory. Tests that measure the broad ability of short-term memory actually measure both short-term and working memory that we learned about in our memory chapter just last chapter. So a short-term memory task would be, I'm going to say some numbers to you. The string of numbers is going to get progressively longer. When I'm done, I want you to just say them right back to me. You're not seeing the numbers I'm reading. You can't write them down. And I would say 3, 4, 6, 8, 9, 4, 7, 1. And you would just have to say them right back to me. Intelligence tests also measure working memory, how well you can hold a little bit of information and manipulate it and do something with it. So a test of working memory might be, I'm going to say some letters and numbers to you. When I'm done, I want you to say the numbers back to me in numerical order first, then the letters in alphabetical order. And again, without you seeing what I'm reading or your ability to write anything down, I would say 3, H, A, 8, 9, N, 7, 1. So you'd have to hold them in your mind, move them around in your mind. So you give me the numbers first in numerical order, then the letters in alphabetical order. Then there is the broad ability of reading and writing ability. This is typically a broad ability that is measured by academic achievement tests rather than intelligence tests. It would include both your ability to read words, but also to answer comprehension questions about passages you read. It would be reading fluency, so how many words can you read in a minute accurately? It would include spelling, it would include written expression. All of those fall under the broad ability, reading and writing ability. And then the final broad ability in CHC theory is quantitative knowledge. So your ability to solve math problems, math calculation problems, math reasoning problems, and also math fluency problems, doing simple math equations quickly. So those are the broad abilities of CHC theory, the theory that modern day tests are based on, and that we have the most data to say this is a valid way of thinking about human intelligence. All right, so our next objective is to describe how intelligence is measured and important characteristics of a good assessment of intelligence. So it all started with Alfred Binet. He was a psychologist in France who was given the task by the French government of coming up with a way of determining which French school children would benefit from traditional French education and which would need something special. It's one of the main reasons, even modern day, why a kid would get an intelligence test. So he gave these tasks to kids of all different ages, and he kept careful notes about what could kids of different ages typically do. And he originated the concept of what we call mental age. Then the test Binet developed came to the United States, and a guy by the name of Terman at Stanford University developed the first American intelligence test known as the Stanford Binet test. And it gave us the concept of IQ, an intelligence quotient. So an intelligence quotient is calculated by taking the kid's mental age, dividing it by their chronological age, and then multiplying it by 100. So let's say I have a kid who is 7 years old. That's their chronological age. If they are doing things that the typical 7-year-old does, then his mental age is 7. 7 over 7 is 1. 1 times 100 is 100. So that means the average IQ is 100. And by modern day standards, it still is. The higher past 100, the smarter you are. The lower past 100, the less intelligent you are. So play with this concept of mental age and chronological age to get a feel for it yourself. So let's again assume we've got a 7-year-old, that's our chronological age. Let's say we gave him all these tasks and he was only able to do what the typical 5-year-old could do. So his mental age was 5. So now I got 5 over 7 times 100. What's his IQ now? Now let's consider that we've got our 7-year-old. We gave him the tasks, and not only was he able to do everything 7-year-olds did, but he was doing things most 9-year-olds did. So we've got 9 over 7 times 100. What is his IQ score now? So IQ testing had its beginnings with the Stanford Binet. Then David Wechsler became one of the most famous people in intelligence testing in the United States. He first developed the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, so the WAIS, able to test kids from like 16 all the way to their 80s, adults in their 80s. Then he developed the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children, the WISC, and that was able to test kids from about 6 through 16. And then he developed the Wechsler Preschool and Primary Scale of Intelligence, the WIPSI, which allowed us to test kids from like 2.5 to 7. So we now have tests that can be used from toddler all the way to the elderly. David Wechsler has long since been deceased, but because of his contributions to intelligence tests, they still bear his name. So we are on the 4th version of the WAIS and the WIPSI now. We're on the 5th version of the WISC. So in constructing these intelligence tests, one of the things that we first need in test construction is standardization. That means that Before a test is even on the market and available for a psychologist to purchase and use, that test is first given to sometimes thousands of people of different ages and demographics to establish norms, to figure out what people of different ages could typically do, so that when you, as a real person taking the test, has results, we have a reference to compare it to. So you're 19, how do you compare to the typical 19-year-old, for example? So standardization refers to that process. When we have a standardized IQ test, the IQ scores distribute in what is known as the bell-shaped or the normal curve. So again, our 100 is our average IQ, and there's an equal number of people who score less than 100 as more than 100. And most people, if you imagine under the curve, represent people who obtain that score. Most people are somewhere near the average. 68% of all your people are going to be somewhere between 85 and 115. And the farther you get to either extreme, so the above 100 or below it, the fewer and fewer people you get. So that means we have, very few geniuses, very few people who are significantly impaired, that most people are clustering around the average. Then the next principle of test construction is validity. Does the test really measure what it says it's going to measure? Does it really measure intelligence? If we've got a valid test, then that means it's going to agree with other tests of intelligence, particularly if they're theory-based tests, like based on CHC theory, where there are measures of each of those broad abilities. And another indicator of validity is that we can use your score on that intelligence test to predict something else related to intelligence, like your academic achievement, for example. Reliability refers to the consistency. So if you were to take a test today and take the exact same test a year from now, your scores, if it was a good test, are going to be pretty similar. Yes, intelligence can change and grow and get different, but it doesn't change remarkably. You're not going to go from being impaired today and testing you in a year and you're going to be genius level. Another way of looking at reliability is within the test itself. So if I calculated your IQ just based on every even numbered item in the test and calculated your IQ based on every odd number of the test, if it's a reliable test, I should end up with pretty much the same kind of score. So reliability refers to how consistent the scores are. And then the final principle in test construction is fairness. Is it biased for a particular culture, a particular gender, a particular ethnicity, a particular socioeconomic status? This is something that we're really concerned about in intelligence testing. When we get an IQ score, we want to be able to say that really represents your intelligence, not just the fact that you're a poor kid who hasn't had access to many cultural experiences, for example, and that's why you didn't do so well. So the next big concern about intelligence is, well, where does it come from? Is it mainly something you're born with, or is it mainly something that is the result of your experiences? So whenever we're concerned about genetics, you'll often find in psychology twin studies. So looking at the IQs of identical twins who have the exact same DNA, and identical twins raised in the same home, meaning similar kind of educational experiences, gone to the same kind of schools, read to the same amounts by parents, etc. That is the condition under which we find the strongest correlation in IQ scores. But you can see even that is not perfect. It's pretty good. And then every time we take out one of those components, we start seeing the correlation drop. So this next one shows identical twins that were raised apart. Maybe identical twins adopted by two different families, or one raised by the divorced mother, one raised by the divorced father, so that even though they had the same genetics, they went to different schools, had different exposure to things growing up. You can see the correlation's pretty strong, 0.7, showing that there's a decent amount of genetics involved, but clearly environment has an impact because we started dropping. Then you look at fraternal twins raised in the same environment. Fraternal twins have no more in common genetically than the typical brother and sister. They are two different eggs, but fertilized at the same time and in the mother's womb at the same time. When we get into next chapter on development, we're going to see that even before you're born, a lot of brain development is happening. So why do we look at fraternal twins? Well, because some of the things that can impact your intellectual functioning later on might have gone right back to the prenatal environment. So if mom was sick, if you were a preemie, if mom drank during the pregnancy, that would affect both twins if you were fraternal twins. So you can see the correlation drops off a little bit. Then they looked at just brother and sister raised in the same home, and the correlation drops even lower. And then looking at just two totally genetically unrelated people raised in the same environment. In that situation, we have a correlation of about 0.3. So studies like this show genes is part of the story. That if we look at brain scans of identical twins, we will see similarities in actual brain development and things like that. So it definitely, genes are a contributor to intelligence. But that's not the whole story. It doesn't mean that if you had parents who maybe weren't very bright, that you can't be intelligent yourself, because we have evidence from federally funded programs like Head Start that tell us your early exposure makes a difference. So if we take kids that are at risk because they're from poor environments, they've had certain risk factors like single parents, malnutrition, something, and we get them into school really early, and we start exposing them to things and reading them a lot and giving them healthy school lunches, we see that their intelligence grows, that it definitely has an impact. So the best way to approach intelligence is that it's probably a 50-50 contribution of genes and environment. It's not just one thing, It's this complex interaction of what you're born with, but also the experiences that you have had. That, um, we could take somebody who comes from very smart parents, and if we never talk to them, never read to them, never take them to school, they're probably not going to turn out as smart as their parents. So we have to look at this combination of both genes and environment. So the term heritability refers not at the level of a person, but within a population, how much of something can we explain through genetics? And the heritability estimates for intelligence are about 50%. All right, now let's look at some controversies about intelligence. So they find that overall, males and females show no significant differences in their overall IQ. However, when we get into some very, very specific skills, we do start seeing some differences. So females tend to be better at verbal memory. Males tend to be better at spatial abilities. So a spatial ability task would be something like this. So you would show them this standard and say which ones here is the same configuration of this one, just turned a different way. So there's two of them. Can you find it? Chances are males might figure that out a little quicker than females. The research that we have tells us that probably these gender differences are more so due to cultural experiences than anything else, and that we're seeing in modern times these gaps sort of start closing. So for example, a task like this, judging the spatial abilities, that's a skill you would really develop if you were a little kid playing with Lego. When I was a little kid, that was entirely a boy thing. I never knew any girls who played with Lego. That's totally different now. My daughter had Legos since she was in preschool. They even market them toward girls now. So could be if there was a difference in the skill, it was just because maybe one gender had more practice at it than the other. Even bigger controversy are there racial differences in intelligence? In, when was it, late 80s, early 90s, there was a book that came out called The Bell Curve that was very controversial, which presented statistics which suggested things like Hispanics are smarter than African Americans, Caucasians are smarter than Hispanics, Asians are smarter than Caucasians. And it really perpetuated some harmful racial prejudices that people held. As researchers delved into that data even more, we found that it didn't necessarily represent differences in race as much as differences in environmental things that are related to socioeconomic status, your wealth, your education, the occupation you have. So as an example, let's say we take these seeds from the same packet and plant them in two different environments. One we're going to call a rich environment where we're going to water it, we're going to fertilize it. One where it's going to be a poor environment where they have no water, no fertilizer. Even though they came from the same genetic stock, they're not going to have the same plants in the end. It has nothing to do with anything inherently different about the seed. It has to do with environment. And the same analogy is useful for understanding these racial differences. Not that there's anything inherently different in the races, it's about the environment. Other things to keep in mind is that race is very arbitrary. There's no biological marker for race. At a genetic level, we're all pretty much the same. There at Macomb, there's a retired anthropology professor who used to say, did you know that at a genetic level, we share 75% of our DNA with a banana? If we share that much with a banana, think how much more a white man shares with a black man. It's like infinitesimally small difference. I really screwed up that word, didn't I? But you know what I mean. Other evidence we have against race is something important. If we take two kids of different races when they're very young and before the impact of growing up in a rich or poor environment had an impact yet, you're going to find very little difference in their IQ. So the racial differences in intelligence are mostly, misinterpretation of the data, and they're more reflective of socioeconomic differences. The next big thing in intelligence testing is, can we even test it in a biased way? And this is why tests are revised every 10 years or so. Like I said, we're on the 5th version of the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children now. That's because culture changes. Things a kid is exposed to changes. Vocabulary changes. 15 years ago, if I were to use the word text, people would think it is a noun, not a verb. They wouldn't think it's something you do, on your phone. If we didn't continuously update tests and someone got a question like that wrong, that doesn't mean they're not intelligent. It simply means that's a biased test that's really not reflecting the kind of experiences that person has had. So no intelligence test is perfect, but modern day intelligence tests certainly strive to not be biased in language, not be biased to a particular culture. Now, even with the best tests, bias can still get in the way through something known as stereotype threat. Stereotype threat means you're aware that a stereotype is out there and that awareness can actually lead you to confirm the stereotype. So the classic example was used in African Americans going into a high stakes test like the SAT. So consider you are a black student taking the SAT in a predominantly white school, and in your head there's part of you that's thinking, I know that there's people who think us black kids aren't as smart as these white students. I want to prove them wrong. Well, that is a very great intention, but what you did now is you put another layer of stress on already a high stakes test, and oftentimes that additional unintentional stress you put on yourself actually lowers your performance and leads you to confirm the stereotype. Modern day research on stereotype threat has now taken it into other realms and found it in gender. So looking at young women taking tests for entry into male-dominated fields like engineering, for example. Imagine you're a lone woman in a room full of men taking an entrance exam for engineering school, and part of your mind is thinking, oh, there's folks who think that us girls can't do this high-level calculus like the boys can. I want to prove them wrong. Again, great notion, but that extra layer of stress could actually lower the girl's performance and lead to confirming the stereotype. Right, our next concept is emotional intelligence, and there's many people who would claim this can be even more important than your IQ. Emotional intelligence is defined as your ability to be in tune with your emotions and the emotions of others, that you can read other people's emotions and adjust your own behavior based on their emotions. You can understand what they're feeling. You can manage your emotions and help other people manage theirs. That is really important to functioning in society, and that represents what is often called emotional intelligence. Think of, I'm sure everybody knows a person like this. They start talking about something that is ticking you off, and you're trying to give them the cues that you're ticking me off, would you shut up? And they don't get it. They keep on going and going and going. They have lousy emotional intelligence. When you have good emotional intelligence, you know what you're feeling, you can manage what you're feeling, you can feel angry and know I need to not lose my cool. You can use your emotions to motivate yourself. You can get what other people are feeling, and if they're struggling with an emotion, maybe cheer them up, help them out. That's what emotional intelligence is. And studies on emotional intelligence have shown us that the higher your emotional intelligence, the better for you. You'll have better mental health, tend to do better at work, tend to do better socially. Most good leaders, except maybe in modern times, have had really good emotional intelligence. All right, our final topic is creativity. Creativity refers to your ability to produce new and valuable ideas, to think of things in new ways. So a test of creativity might go something like this. I would show you a common object like a paperclip and have everybody in the class write down as many uses of a paperclip that they could think of. And then after everyone writes their list, we go around the room, everyone reads the list, and I say, every time you hear something that someone has said that is on your list, everybody scratch it off, and you can't count it. And whoever is left in the end with something still on their list would be considered the most creative. Creativity has been found with other things like intrinsic motivation, being imaginative, being adventuresome. It's a hard thing sometimes to assess, but somebody who is creative, to use that paperclip task, would show originality. That would mean that they would have some things on their list which were unique. Unique uses of a paperclip, which is why no one else had it on their list and they didn't have to scratch it off. People who are creative also show fluency. The winner of our creativity test would probably have a very long list. They generated lots of ideas, even though they scratched out a lot, but they generated a lot of ideas, a lot of possible solutions. They would show flexibility. When they problem solve, they can come at a solution from a different way. They would probably think of uses of that paperclip that had nothing to do with holding paper. And then they tend to show elaboration. When we talk about the problem-solving process and understanding the problem as the first step, creative people tend to spend more time there. So in that paperclip test, the most creative might not have been the person who started writing immediately, because creative people need to be sure they really understand what they're supposed to be doing and understand what the problem is. So creativity is often referred to as an example of divergent thinking. Divergent thinking refers to generating lots of solutions from one starting point. It is the opposite of what is measured by traditional IQ tests, which is convergent thinking. Can I take all the bits of evidence and come up with just one best answer? Creativity is going the other way, generating lots of ideas. So you have this table in your book about the characteristics of creative people. This is a nice little summary for you. So that wraps up that chapter. As always, I am here to assist you any way I can. Do not hesitate to contact me with your questions. Have a good one.